You're this close, the project is nearly done. The deadline is tomorrow. The finish line is right there and you can see it. And then something happens. You open your phone, you reorganize your desk. You suddenly decide this is the perfect time to deep clean your kitchen. Hours disappear. The work doesn't get done. And when you finally sit back down, there's this strange mix of relief and shame because part of you knew the whole time exactly what you were doing. This isn't procrastination. It's not laziness. And it's definitely not a character flaw. What you just experienced has a name. Psychologists call it self-handicapping, and it is one of the most sophisticated, most self-destructive, and most completely rational things your brain does. Let's back up. In the 1970s, social psychologists Stephen Berglas and Edward Jones ran a series of experiments at Duke University. They gave participants a set of unsolvable problems, then told them they'd performed brilliantly. Before the next test, participants were offered a choice of two drugs, one that would enhance performance, one that would impair it. A significant number chose the drug that would make them perform worse, not because they wanted to fail, but because if they failed after taking a performance-impairing drug, the failure had an excuse. And if they somehow succeeded despite the drug, that would make the success even more impressive. Think about that for a moment. These were intelligent people, given a clear choice, who deliberately chose to sabotage their own chances to protect something they valued more than the outcome itself. That something is your self-image. Your brain is not primarily a success-seeking machine. It is a meaning-making machine. And the meaning it protects above almost everything else is its story about who you are, your identity, the internal narrative that says you are intelligent, capable, and worthy of the good things you want. Here's the problem. Success threatens that story just as much as failure does. When you're about to succeed at something that truly matters, a promotion, a creative project, a relationship milestone, your brain runs a quiet calculation in the background. If I try my absolute hardest and I still fail, that failure says something about me. Something permanent, something I can't take back. But if I hold something back, if I don't fully try, then the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, doesn't really count. A partial effort produces a partial result, and a partial result cannot indict the full self. This is what psychologists call the self-worth theory of motivation, developed by researcher Martin Covington at UC Berkeley. Covington spent decades studying why high-achieving students, the ones with the most talent, the most opportunity, the most to gain, were often the most likely to avoid the very situations where they could prove themselves. His finding was stark. For many people, protecting the belief that they are intelligent is more important than actually demonstrating that intelligence. So your brain builds exits. It creates obstacles between you and the finish line. Not big enough to be obvious, not small enough to look accidental, just enough friction to give you plausible cover. You get a headache the night before a big presentation. You pick an argument with someone important to you right before a milestone. You leave the project 90% done for weeks, and then scramble to finish in the last few hours, guaranteeing a result that's good enough to survive but not polished enough to be truly judged. Sound familiar? Now here is where it gets more complicated, because self-handicapping isn't just about avoiding the pain of failure. Research by psychologist Diane Tice at Case Western Reserve University found that it also functions as a kind of emotional insurance policy. If you build in an excuse before something important, you experience significantly less distress if things go wrong. The excuse absorbs the blow. Your self-image stays intact. You move on faster, which means self-handicapping works. In the short term, it does exactly what your brain designed it to do. It keeps you feeling okay about yourself in a world where outcomes are uncertain and the stakes are real. The cost is everything that happens in the long run, because here's what the research also shows. People who chronically self-handicap don't just underperform on individual tasks, they systematically underestimate what they are capable of. Every time you don't try fully, you quietly add a data point to your internal file that says, "I couldn't have done it anyway." Every escape route you build becomes embedded in your identity. And slowly, the story your brain has been working so hard to protect, the story that says you are capable of extraordinary things, becomes a story you have never once actually tested. You start to confuse protecting your potential with having it. Let's slow this down. Put you back in that moment. You're close to finishing something important. The anxiety spikes. Your brain starts scanning for exits. This is the critical moment, not because you're about to fail, but because you're about to find out. And finding out is the exact thing that self-handicapping exists to prevent. The neuroscience is worth understanding here. When you anticipate a high-stakes evaluation, your brain activates the same threat detection circuitry that evolved to respond to physical danger. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, does not distinguish well between a predator and a performance review. The flood of cortisol and adrenaline that hits your system in that moment is designed to do one thing: move you away from the threat as fast as possible. Finishing the thing is the threat. Escape is the relief. This is why the sabotage never feels like sabotage. It feels like a reasonable decision, a small break you've earned, a task that's suddenly urgent. Your brain isn't working against you, it's working exactly the way it was built to work, in a situation it was never designed to handle. So what do you do with this? The first move is recognition without judgment, not self-criticism, recognition. The next time you find yourself suddenly busy right before a finish line, notice it without calling yourself weak. Ask yourself one clear question: what outcome am I protecting myself from knowing? That question interrupts the automatic loop. It pulls the calculation out of the background and into the light. And what you usually find when you look at it directly is that the feared outcome is not as permanent or as defining as your brain was treating it. A failed project does not end your story. It is one data point. A difficult conversation doesn't destroy the relationship. It's information you can actually use. The second move is what researcher Carol Dweck at Stanford calls the growth reframe, shifting the internal question from "what does this result say about me" to "what can this result teach me?" Dweck's decades of research on fixed versus growth mindsets shows that people who treat outcomes as information rather than verdicts are not only more resilient when things go wrong, they are measurably more likely to eventually reach the level of performance that matches their actual potential. The third move is the smallest one and the most important. Finish the thing imperfectly, not boldly, not after one more round of preparation. Imperfectly today, because a finished, imperfect thing that has been judged gives your brain something it will never get from an abandoned project or a barely attempted attempt: actual evidence about what you are capable of. Real evidence, even when it's humbling, is the only data that can update the story your brain has been working so hard to protect. Because here is the truth your brain has been keeping from you. The story it's protecting isn't the truth. It's a hypothesis, a working theory about what you might be capable of, held carefully in place by never being tested. Every exit you take preserves the hypothesis. Every time you cross the finish line, messy, late, imperfect, you replace the hypothesis with something real. And something real, even if it's smaller than you hoped, is the only foundation you can actually build on. You walked away from the finish line, not because you couldn't cross it, because your brain decided that not knowing was safer than finding out. That calculation made sense once. It doesn't have to make sense now.